Today we're going to talk about other errors that can occur in research besides the sampling errors. But before we do that, we need to go ahead and review some of the things that I noticed you guys were having trouble with on the last video based off your answers in the guided notes. So looking at the visual representation of bias and variability in research, I noticed that there were some things in the guided notes that you guys maybe had mixed up or a little misunderstanding of, so I just want to review that really quickly. So in research, the researcher doesn't want bias to be in their study or in their research. So basically bias is a bad thing. They want their research to be unbiased. So if their research is unbiased, that would mean they're on target. And looking at this first diagram, you notice they're not on target. That's why it says high bias here, because they're not on target. So if we just go through first and review all the bias in each of these diagrams, hopefully the bias part will at least make sense. So notice in this diagram, the data is not on target, so therefore it has high bias because it's off target. In the second diagram, it is all around that center. It's just really spread out. So since it's on target by being around the center, it has low bias. The third diagram here, notice it's not on target. So since it's off target, it has high bias. And then in the last diagram, it is on target, therefore it has no bias. Or you could even say low bias if you wanted to. But this is a good thing, it has no bias because the researchers are on target. Now let's go through and talk about variability in each diagram. Remember, variability is how much the data varies. It could be varying from each other as far as the value from each data point. So for instance, if we're talking about heights, someone who's 5 foot and then the next person says they're 6'3", that has a lot of variability in the data. But remember, the more data you collect, the greater your sample size, the more gaps will be filled in between the data. So you want to have low variability. If you have low variability, that means the data is close together. So if you look at the first diagram, even though the data is off target, remember that has to do with bias, it's still close together, so it has low variability. In the second diagram, it's very spread out, so it has high variability. In the third diagram, it's still very spread out, so it has high variability. And then in the fourth diagram, the data is really close together, so it has low variability. So recognize there that it didn't matter where the data was on the diagram. It's not about location, it's about how spread out it is. That's the variability. The location of the data, now this is far off the target. This is around the target. This is far off the target. This is around the target. So where it is has to do with the bias. So maybe just review those and make sure you have those correct on your guided notes. Let's also review really quickly the different types of sampling and then which of those are biased. So remember, these are the 6 different types of sampling methods that we've talked about. Remember, sampling is talking about how people are actually selected to be in the survey. So the first one, remember, simple random sample. We just abbreviated that with SRS. So a simple random sample could be as simple as picking names out of a hat, assigning people with numbers, and then randomly having a random number generator select the different numbers that are going to be in the study. A systematic is maybe choosing every so many people. So notice in this image it's choosing every third person. And then stratified, that is where you have groups. We have 3 groups here, but you're choosing some from each group. So whenever you're choosing some from each, that is stratified, but choosing entire groups is our cluster. So remember, that's how cluster and stratified are different. Stratified is choosing some from each, and cluster is choosing whole groups. All right, and then lastly, we have our 2 over here. Now remember, these 2 over here are the biased ones. They're the ones that researchers should not do if they want to produce good research and to make sure their research is reliable. So voluntary response, remember, is basically where people are self-selecting, so they are choosing to be in the study. It'd be like if I was doing a study in class and I said, let me have 6 volunteers come up and then basically have you guys do whatever it was, and then you guys would be my voluntary response sample. And then, of course, lastly, we have the convenience sample. And remember, a convenience sample is just selecting people who are very close in proximity to the researcher. So if the researcher was standing at our classroom door and just asked a few people that are walking by because they were right there. Now we're going to go ahead and look at what we're going to add to the conversation. Basically, what else can go wrong in the research to where the researcher had an error or they had some type of bias going on. So there are things called, let me write it on here, non-sampling errors, because remember the two sampling errors that a researcher can have are voluntary and convenience. Those are the sampling errors. So those are the two. So the non-sampling errors are these four things that we're going to discuss now. So undercoverage would basically be when a researcher doesn't include all the different groups in the population into their sample. So for instance, if I was interested in studying what students at McEachern like to eat for lunch, and I only asked freshmen and sophomores, well, as a researcher, I'm committing undercoverage because if my population of interest is students at McEachern, I'm not including the group of seniors and the group of juniors in my research. So therefore, I'll be committing undercoverage. The next is non-response bias. And a non-response bias is basically where you, or not you necessarily, but people are selected for the sample, but they choose not to respond to something. It could be as little as they didn't respond to one of the questions out of 10 questions that were asked of them, or it could be that they chose not to respond to the survey at all and just turned in a blank survey. So a non-response is basically no response to an item, which that's what we call questions and research items. But it could be no response at all to something. The next one is a response bias. So basically in a response bias, there is a response. So notice there is a response, but maybe the individual chose to lie for some reason. Maybe they weren't comfortable telling the researcher the truth. And it could be very much like those health surveys that, the school asks you guys to take every year, where maybe you don't tell the truth in one of the individual questions because maybe it's very personal and you don't want to give up that information, but you mark something. So that would actually count as a response bias. And the last one is a wording bias. So wording bias is basically where a question on a survey could have been leading, or maybe it was had too much in it to where you can't really tell what part you're answering, if it's using words that are very confusing. So those are all different ways that there could be a wording bias, which is the same thing as wording of questions. So notice this summarizes the 4 different non-sampling errors that can occur. So just to review, a non-response bias is when people can't be reached or they refuse to respond. It could be to where out of the 100% of people in your sample, 30% gave a non-response, which 30%, anything higher than that is kind of really bad. I mean, if you have 100 people in your sample, for instance, and let's say 40 of them chose not to respond. Well, that's almost half your sample chose not to respond to something. So that's actually really bad for research. Researchers don't want it to be a very high non-response rate. All right, the next one was response bias. So remember, that's when the respondents lie or maybe they just can't recall. There's various reasons why maybe they don't trust the researcher to give them the correct response. Or the truth is what I should say, because it's not necessarily that there's a correct response, it just is maybe they're not wanting to give them the truth. Then we have the wording bias. Remember, the wording bias is basically where a question can be leading or maybe confusing, hard to understand. And lastly, undercoverage is where we have maybe groups of people missing out of the sample that is in the population. So remember, the sample should be representative of the population. So just making sure every group is represented, otherwise you're committing undercoverage. So I just wanted to revisit the study that I reviewed a little bit in the last video, where basically they asked Americans, whether or not they were more concerned about about the coronavirus, and we kind of reviewed that a little bit. But I wanted to show you that good research will show you the questions that were used. That way, as a viewer, you can see if there were any of those wording bias issues, whether or not a question was leading, or whether or not a question was confusing, or whether or not a question asked multiple questions inside of a question, and then the person taking the survey wouldn't know which part they're agreeing to. So just to look at their questions, these are the actual questions. Once you click on that link that I circled, it pulled me here. So they basically just asked 3 basic questions. The first one being, how concerned are you personally about the coronavirus threat? And usually what they do is they'll give a scale, and they probably didn't show us their scale, but it'll be something like very concerned, somewhat concerned, not concerned, it's some type of scale like that, which is called a Likert scale. Number 2, how confident are you that the U.S. public health system will be able to contain the coronavirus? So once again, it's probably on some type of scale. And then the third one, how would you rate the media coverage of the coronavirus so far? So there was most likely a rating scale there as well. So if you look at these and kind of analyze them for a little bit, I don't really see any place where it's really leading the reader one way or the other. It doesn't say like, shouldn't we be confident that the U.S. public health system will be able to contain the corona? It doesn't lead the reader. So that's really good. And it doesn't have 2 questions in one. So how would you rate the media coverage of the coronavirus so far, and the way it's being handled? Well, that would be 2 different questions, so that's why it's good they don't really group more than one question inside of a question. So the questions aren't bad, so they didn't really commit any wording bias that I can see. Alright, so what's the moral of the story? Don't just trust what you guys read in the headlines and think that, oh, somebody researched it, it must be true. It's really not the case. I mean, people really put out bad things and really just put in the headlines, and a lot of us actually do that. We read the headline and then we tell somebody else what we saw, and that, oh yeah, so-and-so posted this online and it has to be true because of this, and unless we actually look at the research and dig into it a little bit, then we don't really know if it's reliable or valid. So now you guys will answer a few questions at the bottom of your guided note sheet just to make sure you kind of get the gist of those 4 different type of non-sampling errors that can occur.